Several years ago, the journalist Gene Weingarten decided to conduct an experiment. He asked one of the world's great violin virtuosos, Joshua Bell, to play for an hour at a Washington, D.C. metro stop. As Gene Weingarten wrote of Joshua Bell's playing on that day, the violin is an instrument that is said to be much like the human voice. And in this musician's masterly hands, it sobbed and laughed and sang. Ecstatic, sorrowful, importuning, adoring, flirtatious, castigating, playful, merry, triumphal, sumptuous. No one knew it, but the fiddler standing against a bare wall at the top of the escalator in that DC metro station was one of the finest classical musicians in the world, playing some of the most elegant music ever written on a Stradivarius violin, one of the most valuable instruments ever made. In fact, the violin that Josh Bell played that day was carved by Antonio Stradivari himself in 1713 during what is known as Stradivari's golden period. It's literally an instrument that is worth millions of dollars. The organizers of that experiment assumed that if 1,000 people walked by during the hour that Joshua Bell played that day, at least 100 people would stop to listen to him. In fact, there was a whole discussion beforehand about crowd control and what to do if a larger than anticipated crowd gathered, potentially causing chaos at the DC metro station during rush hour. But that's not what happened. In the hour that Joshua Bell played that day, only 7 people stopped and stood to listen for more than a minute. Thousands of people rushed right by, utterly oblivious to the fact that they had a front row seat to one of the world's greatest living musicians. In the words of Gene Weingarten, if we can't take the time out of our lives to stay a moment and listen to one of the best musicians on earth play some of the best music ever written, if the surge of modern life so overpowers us that we are deaf and blind to something like that, then what else are we missing? I wrote about that story for my TBS Bulletin article this month, but I thought it was worth repeating this morning because the message of that story is precisely the message of this morning's Torah portion. For the past few weeks, our Torah readings have been all about rushing and going and movement. 2 weeks ago, we read Parshat Ki Tetzei, which means when you go out. And last week, we read Parshat Ki Tavo, which means when you come in. And the second half of this morning's double Torah portion is called Vayelech, which means and he walked. But the first half of this morning's double parasha is called Nitzavim, which means stand. In the midst of reading a whole series of Torah portions about going out and coming in and walking and going, this morning we read a Torah portion which tells us to just stand, to stop. Because before the Israelites can enter the promised land, they need to stop. They have to take time to reflect, to think about where they have come from and where they are going and who they will ultimately be as a people. And as that story about Joshua Bell teaches us, stopping and standing still is something that we in contemporary society are terrible at. We are constantly on the move, constantly going, constantly rushing from one place to the next. It has become nearly impossible to stand still, even for just a minute. As the poet W.H. Davies once wrote, "What is this life if, full of care, we have no time to stand and stare?" And I think that is precisely why Israel has taken the war to Lebanon in earnest over these past 2 weeks. It's why they work so hard to take out the senior leadership of Hezbollah, including Hassan Nasrallah. Because for the past year, there has been a non-stop barrage of rockets fired from Lebanon into northern Israel. Since October 7th, tens of thousands of Israelis have been forced to leave their homes. They have not had even a moment to breathe, to just stop for nearly a year. And as of this morning, as I mentioned, it has been confirmed that Nasrallah, who led Hezbollah for 32 years, was indeed successfully killed in an Israeli airstrike. Nasrallah and Hezbollah have spent decades not only firing thousands of rockets at Israel, but also targeting Jews all over the world. In 1994, under Nasrallah's leadership, Hezbollah bombed a Jewish community center in Argentina, killing 90 people. And in 2012, they blew up a tour bus in Bulgaria filled with Israeli tourists. Hezbollah's 2009 charter includes the words, "We categorically reject any compromise with Israel or recognize its legitimacy." And we hope and we pray that Nasrallah's death will bring an end to this stage of the war and not a further escalation of violence. In the spirit of this morning's Torah portion, we hope and we pray that with Nasrallah gone, finally everything will just stop. On Thursday and Friday, we will all be back in synagogue for Rosh Hashanah and the following week for Yom Kippur, which means that you will have many hours to sit in the sanctuary and heed the advice of this morning's Torah portion. And in the midst of all the coming and the going, driving your kids to school or dance or soccer practice, constantly going back and forth and up and down on Livingston Avenue, the high holidays give us a chance to just stop, to breathe, to reflect upon who we have been, where we are going, and who we hope to be. Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem. You stand this day, kulchem, all of you, before the Lord your God. In other words, everyone, every single one of us needs to take a moment to pause, to stop, to stand still. In the words of W.H. Davies, a poor life this, if full of care, we have no time to stand and stare. Shabbat Shalom, Shana Tova, and Am Yisrael Chai.